Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm your co-host, Kevin Getz, from the sunny hills of southern Indiana, and getting ready to have a wonderful conversation with my good mate, Andy. Andy, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, mate. And after that intro, how can I follow that? Yeah. All I can offer you today is the windy weather of North Hampshire. It's typical UK weather today. Before we get into what we're doing tonight, what are you drinking, Kev?
The landlord brought me over a Harp Lager, so that's what I'm going with. What about you?
Well, again, I've spoken on previous episodes about my love of Guinness. I'm also still determined not to drink Guinness until the cows come home. So today I am drinking a pint of, now this is Ghost Ship. I have no idea what this is. It's called Ghost Ship Beyond the Pale Ale. Basically, I went into my local corner shop in the little village I live in, and you can get 3 different bottles of ales for £6. So I have no idea, but it tastes all right. Kev.
Sorry. That was me just falling out of the chair because Andy's not drinking a Guinness again. Sorry about that.
Come back to me. Don't go towards the light. Come back to me. We've got more episodes to record. Anyway, cheers.
Cheers. Well, you know what, Andy? I thought today we would go to the plains of Catania. You and I discussed about what we wanted to just chat about, and I think it's time for a proper breakdown of Operation Fustian.
The invasion of Sicily. Oh, wow, there was a lot going on there, wasn't there?
Yeah, there surely was. So what are we looking at when we talk about Operation Fustian? What's the objective?
So Fustian was the third of 3 planned airborne operations in the invasion of Sicily. The first one was Labrook, which was the action at the Ponte Grandi Bridge, and the objective was to capture Syracuse. We're not going to talk too much about that one today because that's an episode all on its own, but it didn't go too well, put it that way. The second operation, that was going to be the 2nd Parachute Brigade. That was actually cancelled because the ground forces overrun the drop zones that they were going to be landing on. So the third operation that was planned, and all these operations, by the way, were planned pre the invasion. They weren't just made up on the spot. These were actually all laid down before the guys even got in the landing craft for the invasion. And that third operation was Op Fustian, and that was the capture of the Primosole Bridge. As you mentioned, the plains of Catania, Mount Etna in the background, and that was going to be certainly the last water obstacle for the 8th Army on their roads to Messina.
The objective then was to open up the plains.
Absolutely.
Push on toward Messina.
Yeah.
We've got the 1st Parachute Brigade. Yep. That's the only brigade that's used. The 2nd Brigade isn't used at all in Fustian, is it?
No, not at all. This is going to be the first drop of an entire brigade of 1st Airborne.
Who's our divisional commander at this stage?
Well, our divisional commander at this stage is General Hopkinson, Hoppy Hopkinson.
Yep.
This is before Urquhart comes along. Although Urquhart is in Sicily, but not with the Airborne.
That's right.
He was a brigadier.
He's with an infantry.
Yeah, he was a brigadier.
At some point, we definitely need to do a Hoppy Hopkinson episode, probably along with when we do our discussion about Boy Browning.
Yeah, he's an interesting character.
Because he's unfortunately killed in Italy very quickly. We never get a sense of what 1st Airborne Division would have looked like had he not been killed and replaced by her.
Definitely. So it's his 1st Parachute Brigade, 3 battalions, 1st, 2nd and 3rd. The 1st Battalion is under the capable leadership of the legendary Alistair Pearson. And again, a lot of these names coming out are almost sort of airborne royalty when you look back from both the 1st and the 6th, because the 2nd Battalion is under the command of Johnny Frost, who has already made a name for himself with the Bruneval raid. The 2nd Battalion hasn't had a lot of luck since then. They were in a bit of a disastrous drop at Udna, which again, we will talk about on another episode. And then you've got the 3rd Battalion. Now, I know you've been doing a little bit of research on this one.
Who's in charge of it? Well, it's Eric Charles Yeldham, CO of the 3rd Parachute Battalion. He remained CO until June. He was commissioned in the Hampshire Regiment, 1929, and served as an aide-de-camp to Sir Archibald Cochrane, who was the governor of Burma prior to the war. He was engaged to Sheila Crawford Burton, who was the daughter of a New York family. And this was really interesting. In 1944, February, in a supplement to the London Gazette, It is reported that the king has granted the unrestricted permission for the wearing of the following decorations. Decorations conferred by the President of the United States. A silver star is awarded to Captain, Temporary Major Eric Charles Yeldham of the Hampshire Regiment. And then there are 4 others who received a silver star, 2 from the Parachute Regiment, a Royal Engineer, and someone from the Royal Army Medical Corps, which I had no idea that was even a thing.
That's unusual.
Very unusual.
Yeah.
So that kind of gives you an idea of who he is.
All these names, they're all from Arnhem, basically. It's Bridges, it's Johnny Frost, it's Lathbury.
So who is Lathbury? And this is really interesting. He comes across, based on his history, being very sharp, very intelligent, born in India in 1906. He's educated at Wellington and Sandhurst, so he's going to have that pedigree. Commissioned in 1926 with the Oxen Bucks. Attends Staff College from 1937 to 38. He serves in France in 1940 and is a recipient of the MBE. And for our American audience, Andy, what's the MBE?
It's a member of the British Empire.
Yeah. He becomes the CEO of the 3rd Parachute Battalion, serves with the brigade in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and of course, Arnhem. He's a recipient of the DSO in 1943, is wounded in Arnhem, escapes and swims across the river. Post-war, he spends time attending the Imperial Defense College in 1948. He becomes Major General of the 16th Airborne Division. He's Commandant of the Staff College from 1951 to 53. He's promoted to Lieutenant General in 1957 and appointed Director General of Military Training. He's a Governor and Commander-in-Chief of Gibraltar and dies at the age of 71 in May of 1978 and is famously portrayed by Donald Douglas in the movie A Bridge Too Far. Christ almighty, they've gotten around behind us. So
yes.
So that's Lathbury.
Yeah.
So he clearly has a very strong pedigree. For him to have that kind of career, that's a Hall of Fame career right there.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, well, here we go. All roads lead to Arnhem. He gets criticized for his command at Arnhem.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought about that. It just shows, you know what? Even with a resume like that, perfectly capable of making mistakes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So
absolutely. Let's actually go back to the operation itself. So you're going to have 1st Parachute Brigade, and you've got attached units. You've got 1st Air Landing Anti-Tank Battery, which is your 6-pounder anti-tank guns. The objective, obviously, is to take the Primosole Bridge. You've got 11 hawsers and 8 waccos with 38 pilots of the Glider Pilot Regiment. They're going to bring in your jeeps, your anti-tank guns, and your supplies. They're going to use 6 drop zone stroke landing zones. Well, there's 4 drop zones and 2 landing zones. Landing zones, obviously, for the gliders. The Primosole Bridge spans the Someto River. The drop zones are split evenly, 3 north of the river and 3 south of the river. So you've got 2 drop zones and 1 landing zone north, and the same to the south. To the south of the bridge, you've got 3 low hills.
Johnny 1, Johnny 2, and Johnny 3, right?
Johnny 1, Johnny 2, and Johnny 3. And as you might have guessed, those were actually the objectives of the 2nd Battalion under Johnny Frost. So his objective was to hold those 3 hillocks and secure the southern flank. The actual task of taking the bridge was given to the 1st Battalion under Alistair Pearson with the help of the 3rd Battalion. The 3rd Battalion was also given some other tasks to do. A couple of their platoons were tasked with taking out 4 anti-aircraft guns, but then they were to join up with the 1st and secure the bridge. The 1st Battalion, as they were the ones that were to take the bridge, they dropped half the battalion north of the bridge and half the battalion south of the bridge. As Robert Redford says in A Bridge Too Far, the best way of taking a bridge is both ends at once. And that is true. So you've got the 1st Brigade holding the bridge, and then they're going to link up with 8th Army, which are driving up from the south. Very much shades of Market Garden again. That's the plan. They're going to take off on the 13th of July, 1943, which is 3 days after the Ladbroke operation.
I find it really interesting because certainly one of the things that Frost had commented in his book, A Drop Too Many, a really good personal account that certainly they start to hear the grumblings because, as you mentioned, Andy, they're taking off 3 days after Ladbroke. And they're getting the word of, we've had some friendly fire, or as we say in the law enforcement parlance, blue on blue. And
yeah, we use that parlance in the British Army as well.
It's got to be disconcerting, I'm thinking, that they are hoping as you're boarding those planes for this operation that, okay, we're going to be flying across the Med, and hopefully the Navy has been told what's going to be happening.
That's right. Because again, it's the early days. Sicily is your interim period between the real teething troubles of the really early days.
Yes.
And this is really the make or break part of the British Airborne Forces. There's some real worry by Chatterton and Browning that they're going to be ditched.
It's almost like this is the phase, and I know you're a father, I'm a father. This is the phase where they're starting to walk.
Yeah.
The tumbling. We're not confident enough to do it. We're still kind of stumbling around. So we're worried about our child falling and hitting the corner of the coffee table or hitting the head on the tile. So there's that stumble period. You're right. We're not in infant crawl stage. We are now starting to, simply because the way I look at it is we're seeing brigade level, divisional level staffing.
Mm-hmm.
This is, we're getting everybody involved at this stage, not just a battalion here or there or a company here or there.
Well, that's right. I mean, obviously they had some success with Bruneval, but that's a company. That's a company of paratroopers. Yes. This is a brigade, so it's under 2,000 men. But it's also borne out in that they are learning because they're starting to change the way they do things. In the early days, they're copying the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, in their kits, in the way they drop their equipment, in containers. They're starting to learn. And again, you mentioned Drop Too Many, Frost's book. And he says in there that up until this point, they'd been jumping with maybe Sten guns or pistols on their person. And the rest of the equipment, the weapons, the Bren guns, the number 4s, boys anti-tank rifles, are going in containers. But it's between the drops in North Africa and the invasion of Sicily that certainly the 2nd Battalion start experimenting with carrying weapons on them and having the early version of a leg bag, which is basically an army kit bag with a bit of rope on the end. And they jump out the plane holding it in their arms. And then when their chute deploys, they just literally let it drop.
And I got to believe, too, not only is it lessons learned from when they're in North Africa, but it's also lessons that they've learned from the information coming down from Crete. It's like, we've got to do something about this because clearly this is a problem. These transport aircraft, if it's gaining speed, slowing speed, who knows where that weapons container is going to be ending up and where are they dropping it? And Andy, I think we're so used to how things happened in 44 that we kind of forget about what it was like for these guys in 42 and 43 going, where's my Enfield? Where's my Bren gun? Oh, it's in a container. We can't find it.
Exactly.
So there's something else that he had mentioned too in A Drop Too Many, and something I found rather interesting was that he found out that in order to rally everybody, that sounds either by whistle or by horn was much more effective than using smoke or light signals, which I thought was really interesting. And again, learning from mistakes, finding a solution as you're moving along. So
I'm presuming when he says sounds, we're talking about the first use of the old hunting horn.
That's the first thing that popped in my head.
It's got to be.
So they're obviously they're going across the Med. Frost made comments about, yes, he saw aircraft go down. They'd been fired upon. I thought it was interesting with regards to the drop. This is what he said. There was no sign of Victor Dover, my adjutant, or of Johnny Lane, my second in command, the 2 officers with whom I had made detailed plans.
Yeah. Well, you've got 113 Dakotas in the air.
Okay. Yeah.
And the vast majority of those are flown by American pilots. And unfortunately, it's a similar situation to Ladbroke. Now, the way the Americans do this, to make up numbers, they're using a lot of pilots, same as on Ladbroke, that were airline pilots before the war. And they've been used to shuttling troops around in rear areas, cargo, up to this point. They didn't have the experience of dropping paratroopers or towing gliders. The other thing as well is that they didn't have enough trained navigators. So for every 4 Dakotas, you only had 1 trained navigator, fully trained navigator, and it was basically follow my leader. So the minute they start coming under fire, either friendly fire, so-called, or fire from the Italians and Germans, they start taking evasive action. which means that these planes are starting to fly in all directions, which means you're going to get a scattered drop. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. I mean, some of these guys were dropping, they were supposed to be dropping around about 500 feet. Some of them were dropping as low as 300 feet. Alistair Pearson's plane, nice little story about him is, his pilot basically said, I'm not going through there. And he was going to turn back. And Pearson goes to the cockpit, pulls a gun on the pilot and says, you are going to drop us. And if you don't drop us, I'm going to shoot you. And the pilot said, well, you can't shoot me because I'm flying the plane. And so Pearson says, well, I've got a guy in the back here who's an RAF washout and he can fly the plane. And the pilot says, well, yeah, but he might not know how to land. And he said, well, we don't need to know how to land because we're going to be gone. So anyway, if that is true, then great. It's a great story.
And again, it is the mythos of these characters, how they become, whether it happened or not, it makes Pearson larger than life.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. He's absolute legend. And then he goes on, jumping ahead of the story, he then goes on to the CO of the 8th Battalion in Normandy. His plane, actually, they start dropping paratroopers at under 300 feet. And he comes down like a sack of spuds. And the last guys in his stick, they come down and have severe injuries. And the last guy's killed because they've just dropped too low. Because this pilot, it's only experienced. He's in a shallow dive, and obviously as he's going on, that jumping height is getting lower and lower and lower. So it wasn't the best of drops again.
Am I mistaken? Weren't the winds, didn't they start to pick up as well?
Well, I can't remember about the wind. The winds was certainly a factor in Ladbroke, because it was a headwind that those gliders flew into. I can't remember whether the wind was a factor, but as you know, it doesn't take much to blow paratroopers off course.
And my gosh, the terrain that you're landing on.
This is sun-baked soil they're landing on in the middle of summer. It's going to be, I mean, Johnny Frost, he injures his knee on landing. He lands awkwardly in a ditch and wrenches his knee quite badly. But that is the thing. You say about the terrain, it's actually very open around there. There's long grass and there's reeds around by the river, but that's not going to stop it around from an MG-42. It's going to hide you, but it's not going to stop anything. There were a couple of pillboxes at the ends of the bridges, which once they actually captured the bridge, they took the pillboxes as well.
Lathbury, he ends up in the wrong place because Frost here, he's on his way to his objective and he passes Lathbury's headquarters, and when he finally bumps into him, he remembers it's Lathbury's birthday and he goes, on the way, I wished him a many happy returns. He'd been dropped in the wrong place and had only just arrived.
Yep.
And I don't think, we still don't see this concept of the independent parachute, the Pathfinders doing.
They were on this op, but they've been scattered. And by the time they actually found the drop zone, the guys had already started dropping. Unfortunately, if your Pathfinders are dropped in the wrong place, there's not much hope for the rest of them. Only 30 planes dropped their sticks on the correct drop zones. Some of these guys ended up on the slopes of Mount Etna. They can remember turning round and actually seeing the bridge so many miles south of them, you know.
Yeah.
And some of these guys ended up miles and miles away. They also, to add insult to injury for this op, they also had a little bit of bad luck with the opposition, didn't they?
Yes, they did, didn't they?
Talk about the Murphy's Law of British airborne operation.
So Johnny 1, Johnny 2, and Johnny 3, that's the two-pair objective. As it just so happens, that also happens to be the same area that the Fallschirmjäger are going to be in.
Yes.
And it turns out, unexpectedly, they end up intermixing. And I know you and I both, we've seen the kit, we've seen the uniform. There's really very subtle differences. Certainly, as you're looking at a Fallschirmjäger and you're looking at a British para in full kit during the daylight. Now imagine trying to distinguish each other at night. And so they end up intermixed and fighting through the night until one of the Johnnies, I believe was, if I'm not mistaken, was actually fully captured.
What had happened was the Germans had identified the Primosole Bridge as obviously an objective of the British, and they could see the danger there as well as we could see the opportunity. So they had literally the day before flown in the German parachute regiment number 3 with machine gun battalion number 1. And they'd actually dropped and flown in as well. They flew some of the guys in to airfields. They didn't all drop. But up on one of the Johnnies was the machine gun battalion, the Fallschirmjäger machine gun battalion. And that was actually shooting at the Dakotas as they're coming in. And this was literally hours before 1st Brigade dropped. And some of these Fallschirmjägers are actually still on the drop zones looking for containers. And there's personal accounts of literally these guys bumping into each other, British and German, on these drop zones. And the Germans are saying things like, Hans, is that you? And then getting a burst of Sten gun in reply for their troubles. So talk about British Airborne Murphy's Law.
They're having to do this without their heavy equipment. Paras need gliders. So 6 crash in the men, 6 crash upon landing, 4 actually reached the landing zone, and 7. So you've already lost 12, and then 11, because the 7 just landed in other locations.
Yeah.
So of the 11 that you actually have, 4 hit the landing zone, 7 land somewhere else. So if it does come, it comes delayed. It has to get there delayed.
Yeah. I mean, of the 10 anti-tank guns that flew in by glider, they managed to salvage 3, which obviously going to come in handy.
Oh, absolutely.
The other planes, so we're talking about the actual planes dropping the Paras now. 26 planes returned to Tunisia for one reason or another, be that mechanical failure or they were lost, or for whatever reason, 26 planes they lost by not dropping their guys. 17 that partially dropped their sticks, but not all of the guys on the Dakota jumped. 11 was shot down, and some of those, unfortunately, were by the Royal Navy. And 6 dropped their sticks over the sea, and not one of those guys survived. So that's in a stick of guys. You got what, 18 to 20 guys in the back of Dakota. So that's a lot of guys.
I think so.
It's a lot of guys.
That's a lot of guys. So not only do you get 3 6-pounders, this is for the whole brigade that ends up here for the assault on the bridge. 1 Vickers machine gun, 2 3-inch mortars, 3 Piats. That's all they get as far as heavy equipment.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but on the face of it, this is just screaming disaster.
Well, this is where the airborne spirit, and this airborne spirit has been there since day one, really, hasn't it? This don't give up attitude, this can do, just forge on and get the job done to the best of our ability.
This is really going to speak to the character of the men and their leadership.
Absolutely.
Because like I said, looking at it on paper, you go, God, this is just going to be disastrous. How are they going to be able to do this? And then to your point, the airborne spirit really comes through. So I guess the big question then is, do they actually capture the bridge?
Well, they do. Johnny Frost manages to get together by the morning. He's got about 140 guys with him on Johnny 1 and 2. But the bridge is actually captured. About 50 guys managed to storm the bridge itself and take it. And then they dig in. They haven't got the heavy equipment. I mean, Johnny Frost's not got Vickers machine guns with him. And then they dig in and wait. Guys do filter in throughout the day. The Italians that were there surrender or are killed. I know we joke about the fighting quality of the Italians in the Second War, and there were surrender monkeys and all this sort of thing. But you've got to remember, there was actually a lot of Italian fighting men that did fight, and they fought like tigers. And just the defense they put up in Tunisia is a testament to that. And the anti-aircraft fire that they actually put up for Ladbroke is also a testament to that. But what you've got to remember as well, a lot of these guys have been drafted, and they're not SS fanatics like the Germans had. These guys don't believe in the regime that they're actually being asked to fight for. So it's one thing about somebody fighting for a cause they believe in, but these guys, a lot of them, they just want the war to be over. They don't want any part of it. So the first chance they get, they surrender. Germans, however, that's a different story. The Germans send over a spotter plane. I think it's a Stork spotter plane, reconnaissance plane in the morning, and they confirm that the British airborne have dropped. And this gets back to Hauptmann Stangenberg of the German Fallschirmjäger, Regiment 3, and he gets together every man jack of spare bods that he can find, signalers, cooks, whatever. And it's that classic German putting a camp group together from whatever you've got.
It is,
Pick
isn't
up
it?
your rifle and away you go. And he loads them up with any available transport, and they head straight towards the Primosole Bridge.
And they take it.
Well, eventually they do, but it's the classic thing of any airborne operation, ammunition. Not only, in this case, they're spread to the 4 winds, it's ammunition that really holds them up. And heavy weapons. Your Vickers have gone missing, mortars have gone missing, you've got your 3 anti-tank guns, but they're going to run out of ammunition. In fact, as a little aside for the anti-tank guns, as you well know, this is really where the whole total soldier concept of the glider pilot regiment starts to show, because those 6-pounder anti-tank guns, as the crews are getting wounded, it's GPR guys that are taking over from the crews because they've been trained to use these.
Fill in those roles.
Those roles. So eventually, numbers are starting to show lack of equipment, lack of weapons, lack of medical supplies, etc. The classic things that always crops up in airborne operations. But one saving grace for the British airborne is...
I figured
I'll let you take over the story.
Are you ready to mention Captain Verrill Hahn?
It's almost as if you knew, isn't it?
Yes, it is. 2nd Parachute Battalion. So he is able to make radio contact. And again, this really speaks to the level of commitment and the ability of the branches to work together, because we're going to see it again in 44 in Normandy. Captain Verrill Hodge is able to make contact with the Navy and call in accurate naval fire during the battle. And he eventually becomes a recipient of the Military Cross. And this is what Frost says: the principles of surprise, economy of effort, the concentration of force and flexibility were amply demonstrated by one young officer, a signaller, and a wireless.
Yeah.
There you go.
It. And he really does save the day and bring down some naval gunfire support and breaks up several attacks that the Fallschirmjäger and it's a similar thing to Normandy, actually. It's the naval gunfire saves the day. It really does. You do lose contact, unfortunately, later on in the day. They do get it back, but for a while they lose it.
Yeah.
They've only got one set they managed to get working. Everything else has either been lost or is just knackered, as we call it. And he goes on to fight with the Airborne in Normandy as well, Veer Hodge. The evening of the 14th, the pressure's really on the Airborne now. The German strength has really built up. Supplies are running low. The guys are getting pushed back further and further. And they get pushed back to one end of the bridge. The Germans got their 88s. They're bringing up to pound the pillboxes that they've taken over. So they have to be evacuated.
I was going to say, Lathbury at this time has to make a difficult decision, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And that is, we're going to have to withdraw.
Yeah. Pearson is apparently he's everywhere. He is everywhere. He is running from position to position to position. Famously, in one of the accounts I read, there's one of his guys who is close to cracking under the pressure of the bombardments, mortars and 88s and all the rest of it that's coming down on them. And he says, I can't go on, sort of thing. And Pearson gives him a kick up the backside and says, pick up your rifle, or you got me to deal with, and who do you want, the Germans or me? And apparently he laughs and he gets on with the fight. You know? But apparently Pearson is absolutely everywhere.
I think if I'd been in that position, I think I would rather put up with the Germans before I put up with Pearson.
You don't want to mess with a pissed off Glaswegian, I tell you.
No, you don't, do you? They get pushed back. Lathbury has to give the order to go ahead and withdraw to the 2-para position. And then eventually there is relief.
Yeah.
Finally.
Yeah, it's the Durham Light Infantry and one of the Royal Tank Regiments eventually do get there. And Alistair Pearson, he's made it back to Frost's position with the survivors from the bridge. So I'm going to read from a Drop Too Many, a Frost book. And he says, early the next morning, Alistair and I watched this is Alistair Pearson. Alistair and I watched the preparations execution for a full-scale daylight infantry assault. Again, this is by the Durhams, supported by tanks and artillery. We had never taken part in such an operation, and having seen this, we were determined never to do so. It all went according to plan. There was a massive expenditure of ammunition on suspected enemy positions. Medium machine guns kept up continuous pressure, and tanks were interspersed with infantry. There was a smoke screen to cover the last and most dangerous stretch. The infantry plodded remorselessly on with bayonets fixed for the final assault across the Germans held their fire until the Durhams were within 50 yards, more or less point-blank range, then mowed the leading platoons down. Then they engaged the follow-up platoons. They fired burst after burst of machine gun fire at the tanks, which had the effect of forcing them to remain closed down and therefore unable to identify enemy targets. So even when 8th Army turned up, it wasn't a pushover.
Yeah. Wasn't a cakewalk, was it?
It wasn't. And in fact, Alistair Pearson, he actually makes a comment to one of the brigadiers from the troops coming up. And I think he was alluding to that assault when they were basically going to do exactly the same thing again. And he says, well, if you want to lose another battalion, that's the best way to do it. And Lathbury interjects and says, you really ought to listen to Alistair Pearson. He knows what he's talking about. Pearson actually leads some of the troops of the Durhams across at night, across the river, to put them in positions for another attack the next day, which eventually they do form a small bridgehead on the northern bank, and they do manage to actually secure the bridge on the 16th and into the 17th of July. The bridge is finally in our hands and secure, and the airborne are withdrawn back.
Then the big question becomes, with regard to the resulting cost, is it worth it? And I thought this was really interesting. This was from Air to Battle, published in 1945. The operation against the Primosole Bridge was successful, but the margin between success and failure was very small. Less than 1/5 of the brigade was dropped at the right place and at the right time. And to your point, when you said, so you've got 11 transport aircraft are shot down. More than 25 are returned to base without dispersing anybody. The brigade in manpower loses 12 officers and 283 other ranks that are killed. This was really interesting too. Much like the 1st Air Landing Brigade, as you mentioned, they're pulled back. They're sent back to North Africa. Here's what Frost says. Now we, like the 1st Air Landing Brigade, were shipped back to Africa, useless and unused for the remainder of the campaign. It was yet another humiliating disaster for airborne forces and almost enough to destroy even the most ardent believer's faith. Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite the statement, isn't it?
It is. On the face of it, I don't think it was a disaster because they achieved their objective. They captured the bridge.
I was going to ask you what your thoughts.
Well, very much like the Ponte Grande Bridge in Ladbroke, the airborne took the bridge. You can't say it was a textbook operation because it was far from that. The guys that actually made it to the bridge, or bridges in both operations, took the bridge, held it long enough for the ground forces to get within striking distance. Yes, there was less of a window with the Ponte Grande because it was literally within a couple of hours and the bridge was back in Allied hands. With the Primosole, it was about a day. But they held it long enough because if the Germans and Italians had had use of that bridge, they would have poured troops, whatever they had, across that bridge, and then similar sort of thing to Arnhem. You have a block in line, and it would have been harder for the 8th Army to bash through. So to get to the bridge. So their presence there, I think, was a Pyrrhic victory, really, wasn't it?
I've got to agree with you here. Overall, was the objective achieved? Yes. Was there a complete withdrawal, much like as what we will find out in September of 1944? No, they were withdrawn after the bridge was taken. They weren't used again, as we learned from Frost, as he expresses his frustrations. Mm-hmm. Were there problems that happened during it? Yes. And I think this goes back to our point, which was those are the problems you're going to have when you have this new thing that is still trying to work itself out and they are learning things on the fly. And to support my position on this was a really interesting quote from Charles Whiting's book, Slaughter in Sicily. And this is from Matthew Ridgway of the 82nd Airborne Division. And I think this absolutely applies to the British Airborne. The lessons now learned could have been driven home in no other way. Losses are part of the inevitable price of war in human life. So if you've got this thing and you're learning to experiment with it, there's going to be failures. The only way you're going to be able to achieve that where you're feeling full stride, yep, we're ready to go, to wit Normandy, you're going to have some growing pains. This is part of the growing pain process.
Well, it's that old adage, isn't it? You learn more from failure than you do from success.
Is there any doubt? I hate to use the what if, but let's go down that rabbit hole of what if we don't have Sicily prior to Overlord? What happens then?
I've heard this said before, but Dieppe isn't a rehearsal for D-Day. Husky is a rehearsal for D-Day.
I agree with you completely, 100%. It absolutely is. Because look at the lessons that are learned that are then applied in June of 44.
Absolutely. Even just simple things like invasion stripes on all the aircraft, just try and stop this friendly fire business,
Absolutely.
As far as the gliders are concerned, training with the crews, again, this came up in previous episodes. But it's all relevant. 3 years prior to this, there was nothing. There was no airborne forces at all in the British order of battle.
Absolutely. And so inside of a 3-year period, as we use our analogy of this small child, this child is learning to walk inside of 3 years of formation. Yeah. That's pretty amazing. Considering that you're developing equipment on the fly, you're developing procedures on the fly, this doctrine, it's just coming out of nothing.
Absolutely. And I still maintain as well that it's all this disaster on the ground and everything, but you take a step back, and I know I'm going to now do a what if, but the biggest thing you take out of this is airborne forces need to be dropped in the right place. So your pilots they have to have the navigation spot on, and they have to have the experience, and they're not going to get experience until they do these things. So anyway.
So before we go, Andy, what do you know about the occupation of the islands of Guernsey and Jersey?
Well, I've been to both of them at different times. I've been to the German underground hospital, but other than that, I could know more.
I got to admit, Yeah, if that's the extent of your knowledge, mine's even worse than that. But I would encourage everyone, including our listeners, a great friend of the podcast, Nick Lehere. I probably pronounced it. Sorry, Nick. Islands at War. It's going to give you an in-depth dive into the occupation by the Germans on the Channel Islands. And do take a listen because it really has helped me get a complete understanding of what happened there. So do take a listen.
Well, I think we're getting near last orders, mate. So yeah, he's definitely looking across. So it's time, gentlemen, please, on another episode of Ham and Jam. You'll hear us on the next one. In the meantime, cheers and Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm your co-host, Sir Archibald Cochran.